Resident Evil 4 was for the most part a current-gen console and PC experience, but Capcom also shipped the game on PS4 console systems. The visuals were mostly preserved on Sony's 8th-gen machines, but there were some notable cutbacks. Most notably, texture resolution took a big hit, and texture streaming could be pretty slow. There were a range of lighting cutbacks as well, including a reduction in the number of shadow casting light sources, and absent screen space reflections. Those cutbacks need to be kept in mind because the PS4 code proves the closest match of the console versions for the results we see on the iPhone. Unlike Resident Evil Village on iPhone, RE4 doesn't have a PC-style settings menu, so we're effectively getting one basic visual experience on the platform, with some options to adjust lens distortion, depth of field, and motion blur, like we saw on all console versions of the game. For these comparisons, I've opted to keep lens distortion off and the other visual modifiers on. The first thing that should stand out here is that the iPhone version has a very obvious blue tint for some reason. It's also much darker than the PS4 version with the default brightness, so I've pushed brightness to roughly the same level as the PS4 through the options menu for these comparisons. I'd recommend anyone else playing the game in SDR do the same. Texture art does look pretty similar for the most part between the two versions. If you look closely though, the iPhone code does feature some noticeably lower res texture art through a lot of the game's environments. These aren't huge differences, but the world just looks a bit blurrier and less well defined in general. Curiously, we see a lot of the same issues with texture loading that we saw in PS4, despite the iPhone's much faster storage. When we approach the rock face here, it takes almost exactly the same amount of time to load in the higher res asset on both platforms. Looking through the environment, we do see some reductions in level of detail settings between the PS4 and iOS versions. This is most noticeable on smaller incidental objects like these sand eggs, which have a noticeably squared off appearance on the iPhone. There are also some very obvious reductions in foliage density, which is quite clear on the ground here. Tree lines look pretty similar, but patches of grass and bushes are less thick on the iPhone than PS4. A lot of the lighting is pretty similar across the two games. Primarily, this is related to how the lighting in RE4 works in general, as it features a lot of baked lighting that translates about the same across the two platforms. The PS4 specific concessions return here too, like how this light source doesn't cast a shadow behind Leon. Screen space reflections are also absent, although as those familiar with the RE Engine SSR can attest, this is probably a good thing for the game's visuals overall. On the plus side, volumetrics do return here, though resolution has taken a small hit relative to the PS4. If we look at the shadows for a moment, the actual shadow resolution in most scenes isn't particularly impressive, though a quick glance at the PS4 code reveals very similar shadow resolution on that platform. The primary issue here, I think, is the dither pattern that's used to give an impression of shadow softness. On PS4, it looks acceptably fine-grained, but on iPhone, it looks very coarse and unconvincing. I think this may be related to the very low internal resolution of the iPhone version, which we'll touch on in a few moments. Post-processing also takes a hit. Looking through some of the more action-packed cutscene sequences, the motion blur looks rough and sort of undersampled at times, though I think again that this may be related to the lower internal resolution on iPhone. Depth of field isn't as obvious and can exhibit some nasty artifacts around character edges. These effects don't really carry the same cinematic flair that we see on the PS4, though I think on the smaller iPhone screen they mostly look okay. So in terms of general visual settings, the iPhone code measures up just fine relative to PS4. It's not offering the exact same visual experience as we'd see on console, but you are getting similar enough underlying settings that it still looks very much like Resident Evil 4. This is far better than what you'd expect from a Switch port of this game, for instance. Image quality is probably the biggest sore spot though. The PS4 code, for its part, looks pretty good, with a 900p image combined with TAA for a fairly smooth and detailed final resolve. By last-gen standards, image quality is perfectly reasonable on that platform. The iPhone just doesn't hold up well by comparison. The game tends to have a lot of these sort of salt and pepper disocclusion artifacts all over the screen at times. Almost any time there's substantial movement in the frame, these issues will be noticeable, especially around Leon's hair and in foliage elements. These problems seem to be caused by a very low internal resolution combined with Apple's Metal FX temporal upscaler. I counted a resolution of roughly 300p across several shots, which I suspect is being upscaled to something in the region of 720p using Metal FX's machine learning based temporal upscaler. If we go back to Resident Evil Village on iPhone, we can observe a lot of the same kinds of image breakup when we move back and forth here with that Metal FX upscaler enabled. It's just less obvious in Village because of the first-person camera and because there's less foliage in Village. To be fair, in still shots, the game's image coheres surprisingly well for a game that operates at these kinds of internal resolutions. Interior areas fare best without much pesky alpha to mess up the Metal FX resolve. Considering the performance savings and the smaller iPhone screen used to navigate the game, I don't really think this is that bad of a solution, though it would have been better to combine Metal FX with higher resolutions to get a truly stable and consistently good looking final result. Upsampling solutions just don't tend to work well when they have to work with so few pixels.